Hi, welcome to the Lunch and Learn with our special guest speaker, Nolan Gray. We want to thank everyone for being here with us today. Just as a note, we are recording this session, so that way if you or a colleague isn't able to join us, you can view it at a later date. So this Lunch and Learn is available for CM credits, and I will drop that link in the chat for you all to be able to access that. We ask that any questions or comments that you have be dropped in the chat or the question section, so that way we can answer them during the Q&A portion of today's event. If we don't have enough time to get to all of those questions, we will be able to download them and answer them and then send them out. So we want to just thank the Suncoast section for sponsoring or helping to host this event. So I am a member of the Suncoast section board, and our goal is really to provide our diverse membership with an equally diverse range of professional development, networking, and other opportunities. And so the Suncoast section covers Hernando, Citrus, Hillsborough, Manatee, Pasco, Pinellas, and Sarasota counties. So if you haven't already, you can follow us or like us on Facebook and LinkedIn, and I'll drop those links in the chat as well. So like I said, my name is Corinne Arriaga. I'm a transportation planner for the city of Sarasota, and I am a at-large director on the Suncoast section board. I'm also a co-chair of Florida APA's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and we're just really excited to have Nolan here to really talk about some very timely topics. Before I get into introducing Mr. Gray, I just wanted to let you know that once I hand it off to him, he's going to give his presentation and talk a little bit about some of housing affordability and how we can really change the script on that and moving that forward. And then we'll go into some Q&A, and we'll close with some upcoming events from the Suncoast section. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Nolan Gray. He's a research director for California YIMBY. If you don't know, that's Yes in My Backyard. He's an expert in land use regulation. He's the author of Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. He previously worked as a planner in New York City, where he worked on the front lines of zoning. He's a widely published author, and he's appeared in many outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg Citylab, and The Guardian. He currently lives in Los Angeles, California, and he's originally from Lexington, Kentucky. So thank you, Mr. Gray, for being here, and I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much. Let me get my slides up here. Perfect. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks so much to the APA Florida Suncoast section for bringing me here to speak. Good afternoon to folks in Florida. Good morning from beautiful, sunny California. It's great to be here talking about, I think, an issue that at one point was really just a California problem, but has really gone national. I'll talk for about 35 to 45 minutes, and I'm hoping to leave a lot of time for questions and discussion. So let's set the table a little bit with some stuff that most of the folks on this call probably already know. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a massive reshuffling of Americans. Americans moved en masse out of very high cost states like the one I'm in right now, California, as well as places like New York and Massachusetts, and moved en masse to, in many cases, lower cost neighbors or across the country. Of course, on my side of the coast, places like Idaho, Oregon, Arizona, places that, certainly in the case of Idaho and Arizona, 10 years ago had no notion of housing being a problem, experienced massive influxes and massive price increases. Of course, you all are dealing with something very similar on the East Coast. And this is a significant change that, so far as we could tell, could continue into the future with significant housing affordability considerations. Of course, over the course of the pandemic, prices went up all across the country as consumers shifted behavior and interest rates stimulated extreme amounts of home buying. But this has been more extreme in those places that were receiving internal migrants, right? So I always like to remind folks, you know, one of the pivotal moments of my life was the late 2000s housing bubble. We think of the extreme run up in prices that happened in 2006 and 2007. And to put in context what's happened over the last few years, I always like to have a chart that includes the 2000s housing boom alongside what's happened over the last few years. If you thought 06, 07 was a boom, the last 2 years have really dwarfed that. Good news if you bought a home in maybe 2012. Bad news if you're a household that wants to purchase a home or stay in a home and is dealing with higher property taxes. And then, of course, very bad news if you're a renter with limited protections. Of course, this has locked many people out of homeownership, and it's locked an increasing share of the American population out of homes altogether. We know that all across the country, homelessness has been surging. We often think of homelessness as people living in shelters or people living in tents under overpasses, but realistically, a lot of the homeless population is totally invisible to us. They're folks who are living on the couches of friends or family or sleeping out of cars. And then, of course, the other response that marginalized households might take to this crisis is to undertake extreme commutes. This is another thing we've seen over the last few years, is the rise of the super commute. Of course, some people who are able to go remote, this is less and less of an issue, but certainly for our service workers, in many cases, the folks who are most deeply affected by rising rents, this has meant a longer and longer commute, what they're calling a super commute. It sounds nice, but trust me, you don't want a super commute of having to commute for 2 hours or over an hour every single day. These are numbers, but I think these mask a real humanitarian crisis. These are people who are not able to spend hours with friends, family, children. These are people who are not able to cultivate their hobbies and interests. These are people who might not be able to go to night school to improve their situation. At the same time that we're reckoning with a lot of the land use regulations that we have on the books from a housing affordability perspective, certainly over the course of 2020, when I was writing the book and everyone was thinking about the Black Lives Matter protest, I think we're also reckoning with the explicitly segregationist intentions of a lot of the rules that we have on the books. As I detail in my book, I'm not going to spend too much time on it here because I'm going to focus on the housing affordability piece. But as I document in the book, in many cases, the zoning rules that most US cities adopted in the teens, 20s, and 30s were explicitly designed to segregate our cities. Of course, we're comfortable talking about this when it was a century ago, but I always like to include the image on the right to remind people that people are often sort of not entirely clear about that legacy. Here's a photo I took from Austin, Texas, where on the left you have one of the very nice, you know, all are welcome here signs that started cropping up in the Trump era. Nothing wrong, I think it's a nice sentiment. But then right next to it is a sign opposing zoning changes that would allow for more mixed income, more variety of housing typologies. And I think people really don't understand the connection between these two policies and their values. Then, of course, you know we need to be building a lot more housing, but so far the rules that we have on the books in many cases lock all of that growth into a pattern that we know is just unsustainable in the long term, that's going to gobble up more of our natural areas, that's going to write auto dependence and greenhouse gas intensive patterns of living into law, and ultimately, I think, lower the quality of life of the folks who have to live in these communities. If you want to build something like a strip mall or a new sprawl subdivision, we make it very, very easy. If you want to build anything else, we make it hard. It's good news and bad news then that this crisis is a policy choice. As I've sort of teased a little bit so far, and I think a lot of folks on this call probably already know, in many cases, a lot of these crises are the result of the rules that we inherited, in many cases from decades ago. The land use policies we've inherited have made the American city unaffordable, segregated, unsustainable, and sprawling. I'll go over a few of the rules that I think play a major role in that, and then I'll turn to some of the very exciting solutions that are coming down the pipeline. I'm here in Los Angeles, California. We have a long history of thinking about housing crises, and yet here in Los Angeles, like in nearly every major American city, it's illegal to build anything other than a detached single-family home in something like 90% of the city. So if you look here at the map on the left, those are the municipal boundaries of Los Angeles. Yes, Los Angeles has very weird municipal boundaries. That's an urban history in its own right. But anywhere that's any shade of pink or blue here is an area where the city zoning code has said It's appropriate for residential. But in all of the pink, the only thing you can build is a detached single-family home. Of course, with land costs, that's going to be an inherently very expensive form of housing. We literally make it illegal to build traditional typologies that were quite common in Los Angeles and across California and even places like Florida as well. Duplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, cottage courts, townhouses. Essentially, the only thing you can build in 90% of Los Angeles, as in nearly every major American city, and especially across the Sun Belt, is a detached single-family home, which is inevitably going to be quite expensive. And then we wonder, why do we have a housing crisis? Where we allow homes at all, we often have a thicket of rules that make them much more expensive to no discernible health or safety benefit. So for example, another set of rules are minimum lot size rules, which say you're not allowed to have a home in a certain area unless you can afford to purchase so much land. And as land prices continue to go up in many of our metropolitan areas, that can be a major barrier to a person being able to actually purchase a home. The few examples here on the screen are from studies that have been done of Texas. Not exactly most people's first thought of a context where rules might be increasing housing prices. But in Texas, as in much of the country, there are rules on the books that say if you can't afford a 5,000, a 7,500, a half acre, a 2-acre lot, you're not allowed to have a home in certain areas. Of course, these minimum lot sizes vary across cities, which ultimately ends up serving the function of segregating our cities, because the ability to determine what can be built where is the ability to determine who gets to live where. So we have these rules on the books that say, hey, maybe you could afford a 2,500 square foot lot, single family home, or maybe you could have afforded a 4,000 square foot lot. Well, tough. If you don't have the money to purchase a lot of a sufficient size, you are not allowed to buy a home here. This is a major factor in driving up housing costs in suburban and rural contexts. In more urban contexts, we have rules like minimum parking requirements. I don't know if we have any, if there are any Shoupistas on the call, any Donald Trump acolytes, please feel free to pop off in the chat. These rules essentially, not unlike minimum lot sizes, say if you can't also afford 1.5 parking spaces per unit, you're not allowed to build an apartment building. Of course, this gets you patterns like what we call the Dallas donut on the left. This is an apartment that's ringing the perimeter of a giant parking garage. Of course, that might have been a nice interior courtyard in years past or in Europe today. But in the US, in many contexts, it's illegal to build this without building a giant parking garage. As Donald Trump likes to say, there's a high cost of free parking. Depending on if you have to do excavation or if you have to build a parking structure, this can increase the cost of each unit by $30,000 to $50,000. And again, many people might want to pay that. Many people might want to pay extra to get an off-street parking space, but the rules we have on the books literally don't make consumers make that trade-off. They don't let them say, hey, you know, I would like maybe an apartment that's a little bit cheaper and doesn't have parking spaces, but would let me live in a walkable or transit-oriented neighborhood. We do not give folks that choice. We write auto dependence into law. A couple examples here that I like to share to capture, I think, the absurdity of minimum parking requirements. Here on the right is a modest 2-bedroom, 675 square foot apartment or multifamily, it could be condo. Exactly the type of inherently affordable housing units that we need today to house our workforce, and if it's a condo, to get them on the ladder of homeownership. But if we have a 2 parking space per unit or 1 parking space per bedroom requirement, as many cities do, we're literally forcing that person to consume nearly as much parking space as they do living space. And again, they might prefer to do that. They might voluntarily do that. You know, certainly you can ask many developers and they would say, yeah, I build parking regardless of what the rules were. But in many cases, that household might say, yeah, actually, we want the money back. Maybe we would just have 1 car, or maybe we, you know, if perhaps students within proximity of a campus live here, or seniors live in this unit, they might prefer to go completely car-free. We don't give them that choice. A couple other examples, in many cases, these rules make adaptive reuse altogether impossible. And the examples I always like to pull is we often require parking for bars and clubs. We say you are not allowed to have a bar unless you have 14 parking spaces per every 1,000 square feet. So much for combating drunk driving. Then, of course, we have use rules on the books that restrict huge portions of, particularly our corridors and our commercial areas, to this pattern of strip mall style development. As prices go up and consumer preferences change, these contexts might actually be well suited to converting into 5/1 style developments with 4 or 5 stories of apartments over shops. But in many cases, that's illegal to do, or if you would like to do it, you have to pursue some sort of zoning relief. I very often work in contexts, and I would hear this when I was a planner. Oh, yes, we know that those rules are bad. We know the parking rules are dumb. We know we need more mixed use in our commercial areas. We know the zoning doesn't allow it, but just apply for a special permit, apply for a variance, apply for a rezoning. The problem is that we've settled into this workflow now where so much of our planning work is actually not really planning, but reacting. We say, if you want to build anything, come in and ask us for discretionary permission. And I know that it's starting to sound like an anti-planning screed, but in fact, many of the planners I talk to actually are frustrated with this workflow of, folks go into planning because they want to actually lay down workable rules and see communities grow and adapt in an algorithmic way over time, and not processing these ad hoc project by project applications, which, as we all know, are very easily co-opted by folks who maybe don't have the broader community's interests at heart. We know that the person who shows up, we know just simply from research that the person who shows up at that Tuesday 10 a.m. public hearing might not be a representative of the broader community. Indeed, almost by definition, the person who gets no representation at these hearings, especially when they have to do with housing, is the person who might theoretically live there in the future. That's really the person that we as planners have an obligation to be looking out for, in addition to the folks who already live here in our communities. But they get, of course, no hearing, and these hearings get hijacked, again, as I was mentioning earlier, often toward exclusionary purposes. When every application is discretionary, it's very easy for high opportunity, highly resourced communities to hijack these institutions and block any and all new housing near them, which of course shifts the housing burden onto lower income communities, driving gentrification and displacement. Okay, is everybody sufficiently depressed? Everybody's feeling happy and cheery. You're enjoying your lunch. Finally, some good news. This is a crisis that we know how to end. And as I've been talking to a lot of folks and promoting the book and learning more about the issues, I've been so inspired by some of the stuff that's happening all across the country. And I really want to spend the rest of the talk focusing on that. So I'm going to set out here 3 paths to reforming our current system. And different paths will make sense based on your local context. I understand, the California and Florida state and local political dynamics are slightly different. I'd love to talk to folks about that in the Q&A. But there's 3 major paths here. The first is local governments can and should remove a lot of these out-of-date, anachronistic regulatory barriers that make it hard to build new housing at all income levels and in infill contexts. I'll give some examples of all of this here in a minute. Second, states and indeed even the federal government have an increasingly important role to play in putting up guardrails around local planning to make sure that sufficient housing is being built and that every jurisdiction is doing its fair share. And I'll tease this a little bit at the end. I talk about it more in the book, but in the longer term, I think it's time for a fundamental rethink of what we expect out of land use planning, what we want out of land use planning, and what that means for the day-to-day work of city planning, which I think is absolutely essential. Let's start with the local reform. This is really the easiest path to reforming a lot of these rules. The US is actually unique among developed countries to the extent that we give local jurisdictions almost complete latitude in how they administer these rules. Of course, that varies. Some states like in the US, like Rhode Island or Hawaii, have much larger state involvement. But for the most part, zoning is a state delegated power to local governments that they have a lot of flexibility in how they administer. And some of the things that local governments could be doing here is, for example, make it legal or by right to build missing middle housing and starter homes in all residential communities. Allow your sprawl corridors to actually turn into mixed use communities. This isn't mere sort of theoretical sort of ideas that I'm throwing out here. Jurisdictions all across the US are doing these types of reforms. We know, for example, in recent years, Minneapolis made history by being one of the first US cities to go back and eliminate the single-family zoning rules that essentially criminalized duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes all across the city. They did that less so in a context of housing scarcity and more so in a context of reckoning with the segregationist, racist, classist origins of those rules. Same thing happening in here on the West Coast in cities like Bend. Smaller and larger cities alike are saying, hey, look, these rules don't reflect our current needs and our current values, and it's within our power to actually update those rules. Of course, it's, there's a lot of education work that has to go into that. There's a lot of resource work. You have to, I think, each jurisdiction has to find its comp. Minneapolis did something very brave and bold, which is being the first jurisdiction, but in your typical jurisdiction, you're going to have to find a good comparable example of a jurisdiction adopting these reforms. The good news is that there's more and more by the day. I talked about minimum lot size rules earlier, and same as single family zoning, these are rules that a lot of jurisdictions are reevaluating and saying, hey, actually, if we want to create starter homes for 2023, they're not going to look like, a bungalow on a 5,000 square foot lot. Land prices alone mean that home might be over $500,000, $750,000, $1 million, depending on where you are, pricing out huge portions of the population. And if we're going to keep creating starter homes in 2023, that's going to have to look like maybe a townhouse on a 1,200 or a 1,400 square foot lot. In 1998, Houston, which otherwise doesn't have zoning but has a few zoning-like rules, they dropped their minimum lot sizes citywide down from 5,000 square feet to 1,400 square feet. They did that in a context of realizing, hey, a lot of young professionals or a lot of downsizing seniors actually want to move back into the city and are happy to have maybe a smaller home, but with maybe a shorter commute to work or easier access to amenities, or even simply just not having lawns to have to care for. Houston lowered those minimum lot sizes, allowing individual home buyers to actually make those trade-offs. And what we've seen since then is this has facilitated the development of 80,000 new townhouses across Houston since 1998. That's a huge surge in starter home production that came at no cost to taxpayers and was really just planners sitting down with their local builders and saying, hey, look, what typologies can we build? What's there a market for? What's the cocktail of rules that we need to make sure that can happen in an easy ministerial as of right way? It took a little bit of time, but other jurisdictions are starting to adopt similar reforms. Austin and Dallas, two peers to Houston there in Texas, are considering dropping down their minimum lot sizes to allow for these types of small lot homes, for these lot splits on homes, essentially turning one $1.25 million home into three $500,000 homes. When you do this enough times, prices start to come down and the pressure on rents is eased up. This is an exciting category of reform. Parking requirements are also, I think, pretty significantly under fire right now, and it couldn't come too soon. In 2017, Buffalo and Hartford became the first two cities to completely eliminate their minimum parking requirements for residential and, as I recall, the vast majority of commercial uses. These two cities were operating in more of a Northeast context of they had a beautiful pre-zoning historical building stock that, as you all might know, didn't come with the giant parking lots and the giant parking garages that we mandate of all new development today. And they were finding, hey, it's regularly illegal for small business owners or for small local developers to start a business there or to to rehabilitate old apartments and get them leased up again. And they were in a situation like so many cities where they were just constantly processing parking variances. And at a certain point, it was like, well, we're comfortable with this actually. Rather than process a variance for every single one of these projects, why don't we just change the underlying rules? This reform is spreading like wildfire. Corinne at the top of the talk mentioned that I'm from Lexington, Kentucky earlier this year, eliminated their minimum parking requirements, saying, hey, look, we have a housing affordability crisis. We don't have a parking crisis, and our rules should be adjusted to reflect that. Last but not least, in terms of local reforms, of course, we need overall to expand infill housing production of all typologies. But of course, I mentioned earlier, we are also dealing with a homelessness crisis. And while stimulating a range of new housing typologies will relieve price pressure over the medium and long term, we also need housing being built for folks who are currently in a desperate situation. And that means allowing things like single room occupancies or residential hotels, and not essentially having this population either be completely dependent on shelters or old unmaintained hotels or simply living on the street. We need dedicated single room occupancy structures that can give those folks a home, maybe a private bedroom with a private sink with potentially a shared bathroom and a shared kitchen. These were the types of typologies that kept folks off the streets historically. In many jurisdictions, they're altogether illegal to build today. But if we want to tackle the homelessness crisis, this is absolutely essential. Cities like Houston allow them to be built in multifamily areas, which have helped to relieve the homelessness crisis there. Probably not an accident that the city with some of the most liberal rules on infill land use and SROs has essentially completely eliminated veteran homelessness and is on track to eliminate homelessness altogether. Here in California, during the pandemic, we had two programs, Project Room Key and Project Home Key, to say, okay, we're going to buy, rather than have these hotels essentially just become de facto shelters, we're going to put some money in, purchase these properties, get them subject to real actual deed restrictions, bring them up to code, get them to a place where they're safe and decent and habitable, and then start turning these into units for folks to immediately get them out of homelessness. In COVID-19, there was, of course, a strong impetus to get people off the streets and into safe units. But the success of the program and the speed and the cost efficiency with which this program could be rolled out, I think is a really, really valuable model. We need to be adopting reforms and undertaking measures both to address the housing problem in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. Of course, housing up. We know that jurisdictions that build more housing of a range of typologies are able to get their homelessness crisis under control simply because fewer people are falling into homelessness in the first place. But we also need programs to make sure that folks who have fallen into that situation immediately have a place to go. Last but not least, at the local level, and I increasingly think this is one of the most important things jurisdictions can do, is streamlining the entitlement and permitting processes. I talk to so many jurisdictions where they'll say, oh yeah, we allow accessory dwelling units, but you just have to go get a special permit. Or, oh yeah, I mentioned this earlier, we give parking variances when everybody asks for them. Of course, these entitlement hurdles don't come without a cost. And indeed, they're costs that fall hardest on the smallest projects and the projects that are being built by your small local developers, the folks who don't have an in-house planner or an in-house attorney who can help them navigate this process. To the extent that the entitlement process and the permitting process can A, be fully ministerial and not reliant on discretionary mechanisms, and B, be fast, fair, and predictable, that can have a huge impact on what types of units you do and don't get built. Of course, there's some obvious stuff, right? To the extent possible, don't be requiring special permits or giant environmental studies for vanilla projects that we know are perfectly fine. But then take it a step further. Think about, hey, what are the sort of staffing changes or the process changes that we can make to get these entitlements and permits out the door? One thing that we're seeing with accessory dwelling units, which I'll talk more about here in a minute, that's really exciting to me, is pre-approved plans. So essentially saying, hey, if you build an ADU and it looks like maybe one of these 24 plans that we know what they are and we're very comfortable with them, you're going to get your ADUs in potentially the same day. Many jurisdictions here in California are moving toward that standard. In San Jose, if you go into the planning office with a fully compliant application, a pre-approved plan, an application, by the way, that's been structured to where the average homeowner who doesn't have a lot of sophistication can easily fill it out or find a low-cost professional who can help them, you get your permit the same day. That's huge. And again, I want to reiterate, that's huge, especially for these small projects where when you're building 300, 500, 1,000 units, yeah, you can go through 6 months, a year, 2 years of jumping through hoops. If you're a homeowner trying to build an ADU for an aging parent, or a small local developer who had been doing kitchen remodels but wants to start building ADUs, you can't go through that process. And we need to make sure that the process is easy and efficient when folks want to build the type of housing that we want to allow. I think Another path to reform, though, that's equally important to consider is the role of states. Of course, as I've mentioned, states delegate land use powers to local governments. It's appropriate, I think, depending on the political landscape, for states to also put certain guardrails around commonly abused zoning powers that are being used by jurisdictions to artificially inflate housing costs or to exclude certain marginalized populations. It's crucial that we ensure that every jurisdiction do its fair share. One jurisdiction adopting one of the reforms that I mentioned earlier in isolation is good, but to really solve the crisis in metro areas where you might have dozens of different jurisdictions, of course, we need some regional or state coordination. Here in Los Angeles, we have, I believe, 88 jurisdictions in our metropolitan area. And labor markets and housing markets don't stop and start at those municipal boundaries. It stands to reason that our planning for housing or jobs should not stop and start completely at those boundaries either. California, we don't have a lot of happy housing stories here in California, but I think one of the reforms that we've adopted over the last decade that I think has been hugely impactful has been the statewide legalization of accessory dwelling units. So there's a little bit longer of a history here. In 1982, the state of California passed a law saying every jurisdiction has to allow accessory dwelling units, but local jurisdictions, you can write whatever ordinance you want. There's going to be no standards around how you do this. And if you really, really don't want ADUs, we would just ask that you write a book report explaining why your community is special and unique and should not have to allow ADUs. I will let members of the audience take a guess at how that played out. If you can't figure it out, you can look at the chart on the right and see the red line. In the lead up to 2016, we basically had no ADUs being built in California. Many local jurisdictions adopted ADU ordinances that were just plainly unworkable. They had poison pills like a special permit requirement or an owner occupancy mandate or very high fees or high parking requirements. And essentially very, very few ADUs were built. To the extent that ADUs were being built before, many of them were actually undocumented ADUs. They were simply homeowners, in many cases, immigrant communities who needed to scale up housing, but maybe perhaps weren't familiar with some of the regulatory hurdles they had to go through, simply building these in their backyard. But in 2016, something magical happens. The state of California says, okay, we're going to set clear statewide standards for ADUs. They have to be allowed in all residential areas. You have to allow one accessory dwelling unit. It can be attached or detached. Can't have parking requirements if it's near transit. Can't have an owner occupancy requirement that makes it unworkable or difficult to finance, et cetera, et cetera. And what we saw in the aftermath of that change was a huge ADU building boom. This chart here on my right shows number of accessory dwelling units permitted and completed each year. This number just continues to go up. We now have the 2022 data. It's continuing to go up. You drive around Los Angeles or San Jose or San Diego, and at every intersection, you will see a handful of signs. You'll say free or cheap divorces. You'll say I buy ugly homes, and then you'll see a sign that says free ADU consultation. To my mind, that's a sign that a zoning reform has worked. We have an entirely new industry here. ADUs now make up about a third of the housing being produced in Los Angeles. It's probably not an accident that Los Angeles is now hitting a 40-year high for housing production, partly because of ADUs, partly because of some of the transit-oriented upzonings that we've done here. And this small change has helped to facilitate nearly 60,000 new homes getting built since 2016. These are homes that may be used by aging homeowners to rent out to a young family to raise additional revenue. Families might use these to keep aging parents close by or young adult children close by. It's been incredible for housing production and also keeping communities together. Here in California, we've done a lot of changes like this. So SB 9 legalized duplexes and small lot homes across the state. SB 35 offered significant streamlining for projects that had a mixed income component and met certain labor standards. And last year, one that I'm really excited about was AB 2011, which said, hey, on all commercial corridors in California, subject to certain standards and certain labor standards and affordability standards, you are allowed to build mixed use, mixed income multifamily along our corridors. And it's funny because I think a lot of urbanists occasionally, and sometimes us planners, will talk about this with a take your medicine sort of mentality of like, well, sorry guys, we have to build more housing because we have a housing shortage. We know it's upsetting, but I look at a context like this and I say, this is actually a community, a Strode turning into a community, right? I mean, this is actually, I think, a benefit in many contexts to the folks who live in these communities who now have something more like a traditional boulevard that, of course, will offer shade and a mixture of uses and more new neighbors nearby. If I had 2 hours, I would go over everything in our legislative agenda this year. As Corinne mentioned, I'm with California YIMBY, where we're mainly focused on passing these state laws that make it easier to build housing. We work extremely closely with teams of local planners to help figure out, hey, where can the state be a support to you? Where can the state support your pro-housing, pro-infill, pro-equity, pro-sustainability measures? And I think many states, depending on how the local politics shake out, there's an opportunity to do something similar. One more thing I'll say about state level reform. I think the beauty of this issue is it doesn't really follow neatly along partisan lines. I've given these talks and heard about exciting reforms happening in red states like Utah or blue states like Washington. Montana, with a Republican trifecta, just adopted rules allowing accessory dwelling units statewide and allowing for multifamily in all commercial zones. Flip side, you have all blue states like Connecticut saying, every local jurisdiction needs to be taking measures to remove exclusionary zoning. To me, this is the power of this issue. Progressives might talk about zoning reform in terms of sustainability or equity. Conservatives might talk about it in terms of home ownership, deregulation. You'll have deep blue Bay Area progressives and rock-ribbed big sky Republicans essentially advocating for the same reforms. We just need to be smart about it. Talk in terms of people's values. Frame this issue in ways that will make sense to people, and I think there's a huge amount of opportunity. Last thing I'll say here, as far as traditionally, of course, zoning has been the exclusive purview of local governments, but as the crisis gets so bad, states and then, of course, even the federal government are eyeing this issue with bills with unsubtle names like the Yes in My Backyard Act or Build More Housing Near Transit Act. Can anyone guess what that one does? I think I have a clue. The federal government is likely in the years to come going to play a more proactive role in nudging cities with federal financing dollars to adopt some of these positive reforms. Just this year, in fact, or just last year, the Congress approved the federal YIMBY grant. This is $85 million in discretionary funds for local governments to upgrade their zoning and remove some of these unnecessary rules that are standing in the way of the affordable, equitable, sustainable communities we know we need to build. So of course, there's I think an ethical mandate that we as planners have to act on this issue to the extent that we take an oath to make sure that everyone has access to affordable and decent housing. And if the ethics don't move you, there's also a giant pot of money for your jurisdiction if you want to move on some of these reforms. I'm going to wrap here. I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and also I need to leave some information on the table, so you all will all go buy my book. But I also think there's a lot of room here for especially us as planners to be talking amongst ourselves of what do we want out of land use planning, and rethinking the institutions that we inherited. When I was writing the book and doing a lot of research on early zoning thought in the 1920s and 30s, it was kind of remarkable. I mean, that was a generation of planners who weren't afraid to fundamentally rethink, what do we want these institutions to look like, and what would it actually look like to build healthier, more sustainable communities. I think from where I'm standing right now, and I'd love to hear what folks think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we need a much more regional approach. Housing and labor markets don't stop at jurisdiction boundaries, and our planning efforts can't either. We need jurisdictions to be coordinating very closely to solve some of these challenges. And of course, that's absolutely essential for things like transportation planning as well, where I won't dare to tread. But then, of course, I think it's important that we refocus on the impacts of growth, providing people with a firm confidence that we are addressing the actual quality of life concerns that folks have, and then planning longer term for growth. I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but there's no path to solving this problem at a local ad hoc in a local ad hoc way. Of course, in the near term, for my local planners in the audience, of course, yes, it's absolutely essential that we normalize a lot of these changes, but we're going to need more coordination of jurisdictions and more standards across our jurisdictions to get to a place where we want to be. I teased this earlier, but the US system really is unique to the extent that local jurisdictions, which very rarely cover even a fraction of a metropolitan area, have total power here. Most other countries, there is a high degree of provincial or state level involvement in setting consistent rules and having a high level of coordination. I think this is absolutely key, especially when you talk about issues like conserving natural lands and steering growth in a sustainable way. In California, another really important thing we've done is we've beefed up our state housing fair share law. So essentially saying to every jurisdiction, hey, every 8 years, we're going to calculate based on housing and job growth, how many homes you need to be building to keep your community at least somewhat affordable. And then we want you as a local jurisdiction to come up with a plan for how you're going to do it. The state level housing authority reviews that plan. A lot of them get approved. Sometimes local jurisdictions try to play games and act like they're going to legalize housing without doing it. Until recently, this was really just a paper planning project that didn't yield much of anything other than a lot of consultants getting paid. We've beefed up the law in recent years, and now jurisdictions are actually having to all pitch in and do their fair share of zoning reform to make sure that we're building enough housing. I think it's, of course, absolutely essential that we think through the impacts of growth. I think, right, everybody knows the NIMBY who shows up at the meeting who's like, well, I just don't want any change near me, or I don't want those people coming into my community. We don't necessarily need to be terribly deferential to that perspective, but many times people have legitimate concerns about new growth. If a commercial use comes into my neighborhood, is it going to be a bar that's noisy? If a new apartment building gets built on my street, are they going to take up all of the on-street parking spaces? The good news is that these are actually issues that I think planners actually extremely well suited to play a more active role in solving. We know, we have the technology that previous generations didn't have to actually measure and enforce certain performance standards. We now know, for example, that we can engage in on-street parking pricing or have permitting systems that don't involve new development, lowering the quality of life of neighbors. Indeed, I think if we do our jobs right, new growth can actually enrich the folks who currently live in communities. But I think doing that requires an honest reckoning with the fact of, hey, there's certain growth that's coming. It can either happen without a plan, right? You can see this on the bottom right of this streets map of the kind of ad hoc, winding, dead-end cul-de-sacs plan right up along those streams. It's probably in a floodplain. Or we can sit down and actually come up with a long-term plan for growth that creates a coherent street network that has regular parks and schools and public facilities, and that accommodates everybody, but in a way that actually improves the quality of life of current residents. I talk a little bit about this in the book. This is from Bastrop, Texas, which I think is a real model of a jurisdiction that, an exurb of Austin, which is saying, hey, okay, we have this growth pressure coming. We have a few options. We can do nothing and not allow it, and essentially just have our community fall into a permanent housing crisis and watch our young children have to move away to find affordable, decent housing. We can follow the typical US model of, yeah, sure, whatever developer proposes, you want to come in and build your crazy little cul-de-sac and winding subdivision into the floodplain, sure, why, that's fine, whatever. Or we sit down and do what I think we do best, which is we sit down, we come up with a plan for long-term growth, we regulate the things that actually really bother people. But as with Bastrop, we don't sit down and necessarily say, micromanage every single lot. This is going to be the exact scale of the housing or the exact mixture of uses. We're not going to mandate the number of parking spaces that every new development comes in, but we are going to be stewards of the public realm and stewards of the long-term growth and health of the community. The policies we have on the book, I think, have broken a lot of our communities and put them on a path to unaffordability, inequity, unsustainability. But the good news is that we are uniquely well positioned here to change a lot of that. I hope everyone here will be a part of this project. If you're a local elected official or commissioner, champion pro-housing land use reform. Your constituents in many cases are crying out for it. We know from survey data that this is the #1 issue facing most Americans. If you're a planner or developer, I assume most of the folks here on the call are going to be a planner, be a policy entrepreneur. Identify the reform options, keep track. Hey, where are we getting a lot of requests for zoning relief that we know we're happy to administer? Where can we make changes? Where are the opportunities? What are comparable cities doing to actually address these issues? And be ready when your commissioner or your elected official starts asking you, hey, what can we do about this housing crisis? You're ready to give them the materials they need. If you're a planner, of course, work with your activist. If you are an activist, we got to start building the communities. Something that has been so transformative on this issue over the last 10 years has been the rise of the YIMBY movement, or Yes in My Backyard, or folks taking a radically different perspective from the type of person who used to show up and dominate public planning policy. They say, yeah, we want more housing. We want a range of typologies. We want to live in affordable, equitable, sustainable communities. We need activists to be building communities. We need planners, activists, developers, elected officials, commissioners, all working together and coordinating and seeing what the options are and presenting a unified front for reform. By way of wrapping up, I think we're in a really historical moment now. It's perhaps, the silver lining of the current crisis is that folks are reckoning with these rules in a really deep way for the first time in a generation. And I think that we as planners should be leading and setting out a vision for what comes next. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Nolan. We really appreciate you coming here and chatting with us. I think you expressed it so well. Planners in Florida and across the country are really uniquely positioned to be leaders in helping solve this crisis. When I think about crisis, I think that there's opportunities everywhere to be able to help solve it. And I think that when not just housing affordability, but homelessness, that we have this ability to challenge our leaders and have them also lead the path to some resolutions in this. I really liked the things that you brought up really related to transportation and planning, right? You're talking about where job placement is, where housing, that all contributes to the transportation network. We do want to create these spaces that are walkable for our communities. So that really helps bring everything together, right? If it's too far spaced out, then you have that commute that you were talking about that nobody wants to see. Nobody wants to be in the pit for an hour, right? We want to just get there and get home and not have to have that commute time. I really, really, really like that you brought up streamlining permitting and entitlement process. I think if we want to see these solutions, we should make it as easy as possible. So I really appreciated that part of the conversation. And before I really get into some questions that we do have here, money always helps. So being able to apply for grants or really just seeing what's out there to help fund some of these initiatives is really important. So I really appreciate everything you've discussed. So just a reminder to everybody who's listening, if you have any questions, there's a chat function, but then there's also the questions where you can type in your questions and I'll read them, and we'll have Nolan kind of answer them, start that discussion, really just relate to them. So the first question that we had is centered on the hypothesis that zoning has made cities the way they are today, rather than, let's say, organic market force. But I believe that zoning has more likely become a reflection of market forces' desires for suburban sprawl. Have we discussed flipping zoning on its head and require minimum densities rather than maximum densities? Think of development responsibilities in the way we think of adequate public facilities ordinances.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think for sure in some cases these rules have been written to reflect the preferences of certain market actors. And I think as far as the question of minimum densities, I'm not totally unsympathetic. I guess I would say in most contexts where we would think there should be more density, the first step at a minimum would be to say, well, let's remove these density restrictions that don't actually allow people to build what they would potentially like to build. I would say one of the concerns I have is that you would want to be careful to make sure that the minimum densities are actually financially feasible, right? So that's, of course, you have to be very careful with that. But I would say it's going to be really context specific. And certainly, I think there is something to the fact that, yeah, there's potentially a market preference for patterns of suburban growth that we know actually impoverish communities. I think the Strong Towns folks have spoken very effectively to this, that, yeah, there are a lot of developers who do just want to build the winding subdivisions and the cul-de-sacs that are going to be a huge infrastructure cost burden on communities, and that, of course, are going to gobble up certain natural areas without internalizing the costs. So to the extent that we have policies in place that internalize those costs and potentially prevent some of that sort of antisocial sprawl, I think that's exactly why we're here. That's why we have planners to think through those trade-offs and to actually put rules in place that make sure that new development enriches rather than impoverishes communities.
Okay, the next question. What is meant by removing regulatory barriers to new housing production at all levels of the market? Does that include single-family housing at market rate? If so, why? There's obviously no shortage of that.
Yes. So yes, that's just about the one thing that will make it easy for you to build. If you want to go out and build McMansions on a cul-de-sac in the exurbs, that's extremely easy to build. I suppose what I had in mind was we have a huge amount of barriers at the bottom of the market. But even if, for example, a developer wants to build market rate condos in existing jurisdictions, of course, that relieves pressure on that suburban development, and then that relieves price pressure on all nearby multifamily. And I think, legalizing housing at all income levels, I think, is absolutely key. I don't mean that to imply that, we really need to make sure that we're building lots and lots of luxury housing. I mean that mainly to imply that we need to make sure that we're building housing that's inherently affordable, which is why I talk about single room occupancies or townhouses or duplexes so much rather than single family homes. But even with single family homes, that's certainly in a context like Florida, that's going to be many people's preferred form of housing. But we can provide that and we can meet that demand in a way that isn't nearly as expensive or as environmentally taxing by allowing smaller homes on smaller lots, which in many cases our jurisdictions don't allow, or by not requiring, necessarily a two-car garage that could just essentially further write auto dependence into law.
And so I think this kind of dovetails into what you were talking about. And so it says, have you seen zoning requirements for smaller units that are affordable by design, or transit-oriented development that includes maximum parking allowances, basically using zoning to positively push back on the problems that exclusive single-family zoning has caused?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, certainly jurisdictions have adopted maximum parking rules, pretty sympathetic in context where you have transit. I would say that my preferred way of dealing with that would be to essentially just say, okay, there's an allotted amount of parking that we'll tolerate, and then above that, we're going to actually have you pay an impact fee. So if a developer wanted to build more parking, sure, they can, but they're going to actually have to pay a fee that could potentially be put into street improvements or transit improvements that would hopefully in the long term reduce that that perceived need for unlimited parking, which of course we know destroys our communities. So yes, of course, there are things we need to be doing to make sure that the impacts of new development are internalized. With affordability, mandating affordability levels, that's a real tightrope, right? I see, at least as often, I see jurisdictions adopt inclusionary zoning mandates that don't pencil and make projects actually financially infeasible, as I do see jurisdictions adopt these ordinances and get a whole bunch of new affordable housing. The devil is really in the details, and you have to do the financial analysis. You have to make sure that it works. Market conditions are constantly changing, of course. Many jurisdictions that adopted an IZ ordinance last year, they might have done the financial analysis, and then as interest rates have gone up, that no longer pencils. And so what do you get in that case? You get no housing, which, of course, is the worst possible outcome from a housing affordability perspective. With IZ in particular, I think if you're going to go down the IZ road, of course, and we all know we need certain deed restricted affordable housing. The question is how to get it. But if you're going to go down the IZ road, I would say do certain safety valves, right? Have it be a voluntary program. Make sure that you have certain massing or financial incentives to actually make it feasible, and make sure that the effective tax that's being imposed on new development is covered by other benefits. And then, of course, constantly be tinkering. Here in Los Angeles, we have, for example, the transit-oriented communities program. It's built many tens of thousands of affordable units, including many ELI units, so 30% AMI or lower. But there are certain features that made the program work. They were really big zoning bumps. You could build far more units. You could get certain relief from environmental review requirements that we have here in California that have very little to do with the environment in many cases. You could get streamlined permitting. We had a whole bunch of sweeteners in here to make this an actual program that developers eagerly were, coming and saying, hey, I want to build these extremely low income units because of all of the other sweeteners you have in here. And then if they didn't want to, it was a voluntary program. So there was a little bit of discipline in both directions. Because it was a voluntary program, the planners actually had to figure out how do we get the cocktail of standards right to where we're actually getting units, both deed restricted, affordable, and market rate out of this project.
Okay, the next question is pretty simple. It's, what was the city that has eliminated veteran homelessness?
Houston.
It was Houston.
Yeah.
Okay, and then, so the next one, we're starting to get into location specific. It's fun. I work in a coastal town in Florida. There's a large number of snowbirds as well as a large tourism presence. Unfortunately, when you have large numbers of elderly people and hot and humid weather, parking does seem to be necessary at times. Not all times, but definitely times. What are your thoughts on parking garages, city parking lots, and who should pay for these improvements? Are you familiar with freebie?
Freebie sounds familiar, but I clearly don't know enough about it to say. Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that the work of Donald Shoup here makes a lot of sense. If folks haven't read it, there's a great book called The High Cost of Free Parking, which is essentially the Bible of parking policy. I can't believe those words just came out of my mouth, but this is the sort of life you live when you're a planner. It's a great book. And I think he convincingly makes the case of, yeah, of course, parking is going to be necessary in many contexts, but ideally, it's not going to be something that's mandated. It's going to be something that folks who want and need parking are going to internalize the costs. Of course, that's a difficult conversation to have in many cases where nobody likes to pay for something that they thought was free, and when in reality the costs were just being hidden from them. There are clever solutions that jurisdictions can, I think, adopt to transition to a place where you have priced on-street parking, where the rates fluctuate such that you always have about 80% vacancy. One of the ways that seems to actually make these policies palatable is you adopt what are called parking benefits districts. So you say, we're going to price the on-street parking. We might have some city-managed off-street lots or garages that are also priced. And then all of that money is going to go back into improvements that you can immediately see happening in your community. So here in the Southern California context, cities like Pasadena and Ventura have adopted parking benefits districts in their downtown, where they say, okay, we're going to price on-street parking. There's always going to be a parking space available. It might be more expensive at peak times or less expensive at low demand times. And then all of the revenue we generate is going to go back into repaving the sidewalks, planting new street trees, public art projects, other public improvements. And so to the extent that you can move away from, hey, we're just going to build unlimited amounts of parking until we've destroyed our downtown and there's plenty of places to park but nothing to do, over to a framework of, hey, people want to come here, and if you get the prices right, they'll have guaranteed parking, and that revenue will be going into a pot of money that actually improves everybody's quality of life.
Great. So the next question is, state preemption on housing policy, a slippery slope. I support state action on housing, but believe in local control for other issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my extremely principled stance on state preemption is that I support it when it jives with my policy preferences, and I oppose it when it doesn't. Look, if a state's coming in and saying, hey, look, statewide, we're going to have standard ADU rules that make basic sense, I think that's highly reasonable. I think the state coming in and saying, hey, we're going to impose statewide architecture design review standards, probably less appropriate, right? A state like Florida, like a state like California, it probably makes sense to have a little bit of variation in that. Or the state coming in and setting standards for environmental conditions that might vary a lot across the state. That makes a lot of sense to keep local. But when we're talking about certain broad brushstroke land use considerations, like should ADUs be allowed and what should the standards look like? Or should we allow strip malls to turn into mixed use multifamily developments? I think we can reasonably say, okay, yeah, actually that probably makes sense in nearly all of our communities. Of course, with all of these laws in California, we'll write provisions and to say, hey, you can't do this in a floodplain, or you can't do this in a very high fire risk area. I think in Florida, you all have more floodplains than fire risk areas, but you can't do this in an earthquake fault zone, right? We have provisions to say there are local contexts where these rules aren't appropriate. But for the most part, we've sort of reached a consensus of, hey, certain things are appropriate statewide. I think that's especially true with process, right? So something we've done in California is we said, hey, we're going to have more process consistency. And for example, if a project has an affordability component to it, you should be able to get entitlements out the door in 60 to 90 days, depending on the scale of the project. That's really not something that's going to vary a lot by jurisdiction And so, of course, here in California, as in every other state, maybe, with the exception of like Hawaii, local governments still have huge latitude in how they administer land use powers. And that the regional housing needs assessment thing that I was talking about earlier, where the fair share mechanism, literally that's saying to local jurisdictions, okay, come up with a plan. We know that to maintain affordability in this region, your jurisdiction, this is your share of units that we really need you to plan for. All that's doing is saying, hey, look, here's a broad numerical target. We actually don't care how you reach that. You figure out, you come up with a plan that suits local needs and preferences for how to meet that. That's almost a complete local control mechanism. But it's saying local control in the context of regional planning that really needs to be done.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on effectiveness of state action that directly preempts zoning versus an approach that requires analysis of fair share and action at the local level, but still allows local discretion on how?
Hey, sorry, I think you cut out there at the very end.
Oh, okay. Am I back on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, it might have just been me.
No, my computer is acting funny, so sorry about that. So I'll just repeat the whole question. So what are your thoughts on effectiveness of state actions that directly preempt zoning versus an approach that requires analysis of fair share and action at the local level, but still allows local discretion on how to achieve fair share of housing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, in California, we've essentially taken a dual approach, right? So, as I was just mentioning, ADUs, they are subject to the same standards statewide, but in terms of like how jurisdictions meet their overall housing demand, we give a wide degree of latitude to jurisdictions. I talked about a few of the other states that have adopted similar reforms. In Utah, for example, the state intervention has been to say, okay, local governments, we want you to pick from a grocery list of pro-housing zoning reforms that are going to help to get your moderate income or less housing built, your fair share of that housing built. Whereas in places like Washington, for example, the approach has been more, hey, all residential areas in jurisdictions above some population threshold, you need to allow fourplexes, sixplexes, and more of your residential neighborhoods. I think there are certain issues where we know with relative clarity that, hey, look, like parking requirements, for residential uses are kind of incoherent in all of our like mandating parking. I think there's a pretty convincing case that's been made there that we know with relative certainty we don't need to be mandating parking for new residential development. But for some of these other issues of, for example, where exactly within a community housing is going to go or what form that might take with some specificity, I think there's some room to leave latitude up to jurisdictions. I mean, one of the bits of trouble that we've had in California is that, folks say, well, let local governments come up with solutions and let local governments lead. And to be clear, most of the reforms that we've pushed at the state level have been reforms that have been successfully deployed by local governments. So for example, we adopted AB 2097 in California, which said no parking requirements within a half-mile of transit. That wasn't just something divine. We had local jurisdictions that were adopting that reform and the sky wasn't falling. Some parking was still getting built, some unparked units were getting built, some low parking commercial developments were getting built, and it was okay. But we could say, hey, local governments have tried and tested these reforms, and we're going to scale up the successful reforms. The challenge, though, is that with the pure let locals come up with solutions approaches that, as we all know on this call, there's certain jurisdictions where NIMBY forces are totally in control of local planning processes. I mean, in California, as in Florida, as in nearly every state in the country, in many metro areas, you have jurisdictions that literally incorporate it for the purpose of blocking certain forms of affordable housing. And you're not going to get any housing built in those places unless the state comes in and says, hey, we're going to set relatively workable standards. So of course, I always say my ideal path here is local governments adopting reform, and we're seeing a huge amount of local reform. But you also need a little bit of nudge from other levels of government, be that state or regional.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on filtering and the role of aging housing as affordable housing? For example, new townhomes go for 2 times the price of a 50-year-old dated single family.
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, generally speaking, we know condos and townhouses are cheaper than your typical alternative single family home. And if we don't allow those, then we just get a much more expensive new single family home. The evidence on filtering is pretty robust, actually. there's been a lot of research on this, and I think a lot of the way that we would think about filtering traditionally was, okay, a new unit gets built and then 50 years later it's affordable, right? That specific unit. But I actually think there's a more robust understanding of filtering that recent scholarship has developed, essentially saying, okay, let's say when a unit gets built, who moves into that unit, right? In most cases, it's somebody who currently lives in the community, and they move into that unit and they vacate an existing unit, and there's a chain of moves that's triggered by each new unit getting built. There was a great study by a team sort of tracking that back and saying, okay, let's follow each new unit that gets built. Let's say these are new luxury condos or luxury townhouses, luxuries, maybe, I don't know that they looked at single family homes, but they're looking at urban context. They said, take that new luxury unit, let's follow the chain of moves back. And what they found was that in almost 50% of cases, the chain of moves back extended to the very bottom of the market. So this was somebody in the bottom quartile of the housing market who was able to upgrade their housing because there was this chain of units that became available. And then, of course, when that person's vacating a unit at the very bottom of the market, that's relieving rent pressure at the bottom of the market. And so there's this more robust form of filtering that happens as soon as people start moving. Even this is, I think this is, I had a piece in the Atlantic on this, of, luxury housing has this way of turning into affordable housing, but it's hidden, right? It's invisible, and so we don't see it. I think that those effects are very, and they're consistent with some of the other research we've seen. So, for example, there's been studies of many urban contexts, and they say, well, what happens when a new luxury building gets built in a neighborhood? And the literature's large, and as with anything academic, there's an active and healthy debate. But a lot of the literature seems to suggest that even when a new luxury unit is built in a certain area, because it's absorbing a lot of local demand, it actually relieves price pressure on housing units in the immediate vicinity. And so, of course, we need to be building housing at all income levels, and we need to be kicking in the subsidies to make sure that we're getting units that are, deed restricted, affordable from day one. But we shouldn't, I think, leave ourselves blind to the fact that even allowing units at the higher end of the market can help to relieve pressure at the bottom of the market. And it's pretty intuitive, right? I mean, if you are looking to move into an area and your options are, well, a new building that's been built or the existing housing stock, and you need to live in a certain area, well, if new housing is getting built, cool, great, I can move into a unit and no one's feeling any new price pressure or rent pressure or certainly displacement. But if those new units are coming on, then essentially new households have no choice but to bid up the price of existing units. And of course, where renters are involved, that can lead to displacement. So, I would encourage folks to look into some of that new literature on filtering.
Okay, in Tampa Bay, we're trapped in a vicious cycle. Existing infrastructure cannot support greater density, or opponents of growth claim this pretextually. At the same time, localities need to finance bonds improvements through more development, i.e. property taxes, impact fees, exactions, etc. Therefore, the political compromise has been more low-density sprawl and greenfield development, which has done nothing to address housing affordability or budgets. How can zoning reform break us out of this status quo?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, my friends over at the Strong Towns community, I'll raise them again. I mean, they have this notion of the growth Ponzi scheme, right? Where it's like, okay, well, we'll get some new free infrastructure from developers out in suburban sprawl, and we don't have to pay for it. But then, of course, over time, that's a huge fiscal burden, right? Because the maintenance costs of that are going to fall back on jurisdictions, and you're going to have, vanishingly few units consuming huge amounts of infrastructure. Put yourself in essentially a crisis situation like what you've seen in some Rust Belt cities. When they start winding down, it gets very nasty. I mean, this is a challenge as old as time, right? How do you make planning work in a context where politics are often hostile to the things we know we need to do? Of course, in the longer term, it's better for the long-term health of the community to be reinvesting in the infrastructure in our existing urban areas. And I think you're right. A lot of times people have pretextual, unfounded concerns about water and sewer. I remember I worked on a fairly large project when I was in New York, and a lady comes up and she's like, "Well, we don't have the sewer capacity for this project." And I said, "Oh, well, we actually did a sewer study. I'd be happy to share it with you." And she's like, "Oh, I don't believe that nonsense." It's like, well, okay, I can't really do anything for you, but if I'm telling you that we hired stormwater professionals to study it, and they told us a certain thing. So sometimes it is pretextual, but sometimes it's not. And absolutely, certainly in many Sunbelt contexts, you might have to be scaling up, infill wet infrastructure to accommodate new growth. I would say that, look, the growth is coming one way or another, right? And that's really the choice facing cities. The growth is coming, and it can take one of three forms. We can say no to it, and we can fall into a permanent housing crisis. That's what places across all of California did, and now young California households have to leave the state, and families and communities are being destroyed. You can follow the typical US growth paradigm of more and more sprawl that's going to be horrible for the environment, horrible from an equity perspective, force people into auto dependence and 1 hour long commutes. Or we can make the hard choices and do the hard planning work of saying, hey, we're going to have a long-term plan for growth. We're going to reinvest in some of our divested urban areas. We're going to do the infill. We're going to build great communities. I would say that we as planners have an obligation to be championing that third alternative, that alternative that actually enriches our communities rather than impoverishes them over time. It's not easy, but I think that's why we're here, right?
And so I think this one is going to be good to kind of connect with that last statement. So as the founder of the Housing Leadership Council of Tampa Bay, I look forward to incorporating much of what you discussed today. How to get folks to work together on this nonprofit effort is crucial, but how do we get competing forces to work together?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, that's similar in line with the previous question. Look, I think it's important to level set and essentially, if you can get everyone on the same page of, look, we know the status quo is not going to work. The status quo is not working. We need to be doing housing is the #1 quality of life issue facing our communities, and the only way we have of solving it is to have more sprawl that destroys our communities in the long term. If you can get folks to a place where there's a frank shared recognition of the problem, then we can at least get folks to a place where they can say, okay, it's time to start thinking of real solutions, and be ready with those solutions. Have that laundry list of, hey, here are a dozen things that jurisdictions not unlike Tampa have done to try to get these costs under control. And a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I think this was a challenge. There might not have been a lot of very good comps, but you're in a good position now where cities all across the country are adopting these reforms, and there are a lot of tried and tested ideas that be ready, right? So I think it's a multi-step process. I think having a shared recognition of the crisis and then being ready with certain solutions is the best I can advise. I would also say too, talk to non-traditional allies. Talk to folks who maybe historically aren't seen as being housing interests, right? I think a lot of electeds think, oh, okay, the housing people are, the housing nonprofits and then the builders. That's what the housing political landscape looks like. But a lot of YIMBY groups have formed close alliances with, for example, the AARP, who's like, look, we want to make sure that aging homeowners can stay in their home and maybe have an additional source of income and build an ADU, or that maybe they can move into an ADU and have their young adult children with their family move into the main unit. Or talk to groups like local NAACP chapters who are saying, yeah, we are trying to reckon with the segregationist origins of some of these rules, and we would be part of a coalition. Talk to the folks who are engaged in homeless services. So often those folks are like, hey, look, I have Section 8. I've tenants who've received Section 8 or tenants who I'm ready to get them into a unit, but the unit just doesn't exist. Think about the range of possible allies. And it's, of course, we work very, very, very closely with home builders, and we work closely with traditional housing nonprofits. But as this issue, expands and affects more people's lives, more and more groups are wanting to get involved in this space. And I think that's potentially one way that you can move the ball.
Okay, this one is a little bit longer, but I think since we have about 15 minutes left of the event, I'm just going to read it so that way you can get the full picture. So I completely agree with everything you outline in your book regarding zoning, housing affordability, parking, transportation challenges that come with zoning, and the abysmal bureaucracy that comes with outdated zoning laws. However, if zoning were to be abolished, how would you recommend going about preserving uses outside of just residential uses? As an example, in our county, employment lands and industrial lands that we typically reserve for high-wage jobs are scarce and are now able to be converted to residential uses due to state preemption laws. If zoning were abolished, I worry about communities communities' ability to keep a jobs and housing balance if one of the few ways we as planners are able to preserve land for high wage employment has effectively been scrapped in the name of making housing more affordable?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think the jobs housing balance thing is, I think, a major consideration, of course, here in California. Of course, we're much more on the end of we allow a lot of jobs and we don't allow any new housing. Look, I think what we need is a high degree of flexibility in some of these areas. I mean, I think it's going to depend on local context, but not necessarily always falling back on zoning rules that say we're going to assign the allowed uses for every single parcel. But using other more reliable mechanisms to actually achieve some of these outcomes, right? We have fiscal tools in our toolkit. We have other regulatory tools in our toolkit that I think we can use to actually solve some of these problems. And zoning often ends up being sort of a very clumsy clutch, right? I mean, I know in New York, the main way that this was used was, for example, we had areas that were zoned for industrial. And this was sort of New York's sort of de facto industrial policy, right? The idea was if we just keep these areas zoned for industrial for long enough, we're eventually going to get the new industrial jobs. What essentially ended up happening in New York was those lots sat vacant for decades, and then some clever developers figured out that they could build hotels and self-storage units on these lots, and then the city was essentially playing whack-a-mole, saying, well, we don't want that type of commercial on these lots. And then eventually, like reality bailed the city out, and now we have this warehouse building boom. But of course, they're also sort of upset about the warehouses. I think to the extent that we have land use planning focused on this idea of we want certain particular land uses on certain particular lots, I think that's a very risky game, and often that can backfire. And I think there are other ways to address some of these concerns that I think are more sustainable and have less risk of unintended consequences in the long term. But it's a totally fair question. I mean, it's a tough issue, and I mean, I know, as we know today, we try to use zoning to solve that problem, and as the question implied, right, it's a deeply imperfect mechanism that often gets subverted by other concerns. So, complicated question. Unsatisfactory answer, I'm sure.
Sometimes it's just to get us thinking on how we can move forward, right? I don't think there's one right answer. There's, a laundry list of right answers that you can implement. It also matters about context, right? What's happening, what's right for your community, what's the right fit for that specific area. Okay, so how do you address supply side skepticism and housing filtering in speaking with policymakers? Thinking of situations where community groups protest an upzoning or development approvals on the grounds that a specific new development itself won't be affordable.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I think this is where, we as planners need to be familiar with the research and be familiar with the work that's being done on this. There are a lot of great resources out there, and I'm happy to share them in follow-up correspondence, but making that case that I was making about filtering of, hey, these might be new market rate units, but those 100 market rate units are going to absorb demand that might have fallen on other units. They're going to trigger a chain of moves that's going to relieve price pressure at all levels of the market. Of course, a lot of people, as with the infrastructure thing, they're making these arguments in bad faith, but to the extent that there's folks watching those discussions, or to the extent that folks are making those concerns in good faith, I think saying, hey, look, we know from the research, right? Or we know from the research that metropolitan areas that are building housing commensurate to demand and commensurate to jobs are having less significant price pressures over the long term. I also think too, it helps to, at least turn the temperature down a little bit to, have successful comparable developments, right? I think this is something I do over on Twitter, showing redevelopments that have happened, because right when the development's still theoretical, and when the development's still this, massing model on paper with the funny lighting, like at 6 p.m. on a Thursday in Southern California, right? Like, people are just like, I don't believe that vision of what this is going to look like. But to the extent that you can get a few of these successful projects through that present a model of an alternative pattern of development, I think you can start to turn the temperature down a little bit. I think too, also, potentially when you're talking about, for example, legalizing accessory dwelling units or legalizing duplexes, the most effective strategy I've seen for helping folks to understand what this means is point to the examples that already exist in your community. nearly every major American city has these pre-zoning inner suburbs that have a mixture of housing typologies. And in many cases, not only are they not these disfavored neighborhoods, but they're actually some of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. And you can say, hey, look, we already have neighborhoods that kind of look like this mixture of missing middle typologies, and it's actually really desirable, right? This mixture of duplexes and single family homes and small apartment buildings and a corner grocery. In many cases, these are very desirable places to live. And when you can point to something that already exists and in many cases is already beloved and locally known and understood, and so nice in many cases that we subject them to preservation ordinances, then folks start to see, okay, look, this makes sense to me, and this is something I can get behind.
Okay, so I know you mentioned that you live in California, but what type of house do you live in and how many cars does your family own? More of a get to know you kind of question.
Yeah, I like that. So I live in a dingbat, which I actually am wearing my dingbat pen. It's a certain type of two-story multifamily that was built en masse in Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s. It was a response to newly adopted parking requirements. So these are all parking bays. This was unglamorous, affordable mass housing that was probably only intended to last 30 years. And here I am 70 years later living in one. And my neighbor can probably hear me giving this webinar. I live in a dingbat, and I have one car. I hadn't had a car for 5 years when I'd been living in DC and New York, and I thought I was going to come out to LA and show these Angelinos how to live car free, and LA, as I'm sure Tampa would, just beats you into submission and you end up buying a car. But I'm a transit commuter, if that's any consolation.
Well, I live in Bradenton and I work in Sarasota, and the only way I can get to work is in a car, and I wish there was another way. But unfortunately, we're not there yet, but there's hope that we can move to something different. The next question is, the Florida legislature has recently mandated the local governments allow housing construction in commercial industrial areas if that housing includes a % of affordable units. Some local governments are concerned about maintaining their employment base. Have you seen this sort of policy elsewhere, and how has it worked?
Yes, so I think this is a relatively new category of reforms. As I mentioned in the talk, here in California, we've done this with AB 2011, where we've set on all of our commercial corridors above a certain width. If there's zone commercial, you have to allow mixed-use multifamily. I don't know that I'm terribly familiar with many jurisdictions having that touchdown in industrial areas, but it's increasingly common for jurisdictions to say, we're going to allow for more commercial or we're going to allow for more residential and commercial areas. And this was in California, as in many places, this was a response to COVID changes, right? I mean, what we've seen in California, as in much of the rest of the country, is you have a lot of down market office space where those firms went fully remote. And realistically, I tended to think that we were going to actually see a mass move back into the office. But it's, we've actually seen in many cases firms stay fully remote, and there's been a permanent shift down in office demand. Something similar is happening with retail, where so much retail is moving online, and we're seeing a lot of commercial vacancies here. I can't speak to the Suncoast context, but in California and in many contexts, we were having really high retail vacancies. So we were looking at this, we're saying, okay, look, we have all of our commercial corridors, which are basically stroads, an unpleasant combination of a street and a road that does neither well. And we have all of these half-empty strip malls and all of these half-empty office parks that realistically are not going to be fully leased out for the near future. At the same time, we have this severe housing shortage. That presented to us an opportunity to say, well, let's kill two birds with one stone here. I think one challenge that we face in California that's very unique is that we have really tight restrictions on how local governments can assess property taxes. So local jurisdictions end up becoming dependent on local sales taxes and local income taxes to actually meet their needs. And of course, that they have that concern of, we need to make sure that we keep jobs and we keep retail. I've not heard significant concerns quite yet about this. And in fact, many of the property owners who own these commercial properties were saying, look, there was no viable commercial or industrial use for this in the near future, but there's enormous demand for mixed income, mixed use multifamily. So that's been the experience here in California.
Well, it looks like we have about time for one more question. And the ones, like I said in the beginning, that we don't get to today, we will download the questions and, Nolan and I will get together and answer them and then send them out to everybody. So don't worry if your question wasn't answered today. Just a side note, I dropped some upcoming Suncoast events in the chat. If you are all interested, you can look at those and see how you can get involved in that. So for our last question today, in your book and presentation, it seems like you use the word decriminalization or decriminalize as opposed to permit or allow when discussing affordable housing typologies. Was this word choice done on purpose?
Yes, of course. No, I think
Words
this,
matter.
I think this, yeah, words matter. I think it sort of clarifies the current policies that are in place, and it helps people understand how weird a lot of our rules are. When you of course it's easy to say, well, we don't permit this, we don't allow this. It sounds very technocratic. I think it drains the sort of weight from the issue. But when you say, hey, if you try to build a duplex on your property, the code enforcer is going to come out and you're going to be assessed fees. And if you don't pay those fees, you're going to go to jail, right? Or escalating bad things are going to happen. Your property is going to be seized. Okay. Like I think when you put it in those terms, you start to understand that's really weird, right? Like, do we really want to do that to people who build an ADU that's perfectly safe in their backyard? Do we really want to do that to people who want to subdivide their home and create 2 or 3 smaller units? As long as they're following health and safety standards, do we really want to block that? Of course, it would never escalate to this situation with a commercial property because these are going to be owned by commercial investors. But if it did happen, would we really want it to be this controversial legal matter that somebody wanted to turn a strip mall into an apartment building? I think when you talk about this in those terms, it starts to become obvious of like, well, yes, of course, it doesn't make sense that that's what we're focusing our land use authorities on. And I think a whole generation of planners is starting to realize this, right? We didn't go into planning because we wanted to count the number of parking spaces in new development. We didn't go into planning because we wanted to call the homeowner and say, hey, that ADU that you built or that you want to build, you can't build that. We went into planning because we wanted to sit down, bring folks to the table, come up with a long-term plan for growth that puts our communities on a sustainable and equitable path. To the extent that we can, I think, retool our land use planning institutions to where we're doing less of the former, the thing that nobody went to planning school for and nobody works as a planner today to do, and more of the latter. I think it puts the profession in a healthier place, and it puts us back in a place where we're actually leading on the issues that really, really matter to people.
And those are some great points. We really appreciate you being here with us today to share all of the information as well as kind of get into some of these detailed discussions, right? Thanks everyone for attending today. I know it was over your lunch break, but hopefully you got to eat and learn and listen. Like I said, there are some upcoming events from the Suncoast. I dropped them in the chat. There's definitely ways for you to get involved if you live in the Tampa Bay area or the Suncoast region. Like I said, we will answer the questions that didn't get answered today and send that out along with the presentation that was provided. So we really appreciate everyone's attendance. And once again, thank you so much for being here with us, Nolan. Great presentation.
The pleasure's all mine. Thanks for everyone for tuning in, and thanks for having me.
Yes.